In February, 3 Muslim students were shot dead in North Carolina in the United States, and a mosque in Houston, Texas was torched. Is Islamophobia on the rise? If so, what can be done to counter it? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Three young Muslims were killed in North Carolina in what police say was a dispute over parking. But the incident is now being investigated as a possible hate crime. U.S. President Barack Obama sent this message to the American Muslim community following the incident.
Many Muslim Americans are worried and afraid. And I want to be as clear as I can be. As Americans, all faiths and backgrounds, we stand with you in your grief, and we offer our love and we offer our support.
A report by the Center for American Progress found that there is an Islamophobia network spreading misinformation and hateful propaganda within the United States about Muslims and Islam. In Europe, Muslim advocacy groups report a rise in Islamophobia. They also report an increase in attacks on mosques and on Muslims following the deadly shootings at the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, where 2 Islamist gunmen opened fire. What is the situation like for ordinary Muslims facing Islamophobia? What's the role of the media in all of this? And why is religion being conflated with terrorism? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Yasmin Tayeb. She is the co-author of the report by the Center for American Progress on Islamophobia. Joining us from North Carolina is Imam Abdullah Entepli. He is the Chief Representative of Muslim Affairs at Duke University. And joining us from London is a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain, Tala Ahmed. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Yasmin, let's start right here in the studio. Your organization, the Center for American Progress, has found that there is a concerted effort on the part of some group or groups to demonize Muslims, to portray them in a very bad light. It seems very insidious. What did you find?
Sure. So, as you're probably aware, Center for American Progress initially in 2011 published their first report called Fear, Inc. Fear, Inc. basically identified and exposed chronicled a tightly knit network that was responsible for fanning anti-Muslim sentiment hysteria in the United States. And the findings of our second report revealed not just that this network has continued pushing for discriminatory policies against a community of 3 million Americans, but what we found out was that this network, which is comprised of a tightly knit network of funders, organizations, activists, politicians, as well as media commentators, the money that has been contributed to this network has increased. There's about $57 million that's been contributed to this network that's essentially a group of hate organizations that they're spreading misinformation and hate about Muslim Americans.
So they have the money, they have the voice. Mm-hmm. Are they being heard in the United States?
Unfortunately, unfortunately they are. What we try to make clear is that this is a fringe network. We'd like to keep them on, the fringes of American society. They're obviously not mainstream, and some of the groups that we exposed and identified, a number of them are connected to, for example, the Republican Party, but these are, extreme factions of the far right. So I definitely wouldn't say that they're part of mainstream American sentiment, but we'd like to hope that they keep on the fringes.
Abdullah, you're out there in North Carolina, and as I've just been saying, there were 3 Muslim people who were killed. They belong to the same family. What kind of impact did those killings have on you and your family, for instance?
Well, the horrific killings took place about 2 miles from where my children go to school, about 3 miles where I live. And I knew both families, and all the victims and their siblings are close friends of ours. And local Muslim community is completely traumatized, as you can imagine. The day after the horrific killing, no one, including myself, we didn't send our children to school. And as the initial statements and explanation of the local law enforcement wasn't all that helpful and there was a lot of misinformation that the killer has so many other friends. They were looking for some more Muslims to kill. And no one can blame Muslims being extra cautious, if not paranoid, in the heat of the moment. And the dust has yet to settle down because if anything, if the recent Chapel Hill shooting, the mosque burning in Houston, in what happened in Rhode Island, the attacks in Michigan, just in 1 week, if that doesn't convince anybody in the United States about the despicable rise of Islamophobia, rising anti-Islam and anti-Muslim sentiments, I don't know what will convince anybody. I don't know how bad, how worse it should get before, as a society, we would recognize this big monster that these 3 horrific killings is clearly pointing out to, and put our acts together and fight against it.
So clearly this is causing a lot of fear among the Muslim community. Let's go to London to Tala Ahmed there. Tala, you know, we've just been hearing that to a large extent Islamophobia is being driven by these fringe groups, these hate groups that are instigating feelings and sentiments against Muslims. But I'm wondering, to what extent is Islamophobia fueled by the policies of governments or of police and security forces? I mean, we've seen so many instances of Muslims being discriminated against. We see it at airports, we see it at schools, we see it at mosques, mosques being infiltrated in New York, for instance. To what extent do officials have a responsibility for fueling this rising tide of sentiment against Muslims?
I think, I mean, it really depends on which government you're talking about. I mean, if you talk about the UK government, I would not say that the government is deliberately feeding into the narrative of Islamophobes. But there are policies, I mean, for example, the entire counter-terrorism policy of the British government, for example, you could say that some of it is capable of depicting Muslim community in a very negative light. And also sometimes when politicians talk about terrorism and jihadism, for example, they fail to distinguish that these terrorists who are a threat to all of us, Muslim community abhor them as much as the wider community. And yet often the connotation is as if Muslim community is complicit, almost like guilty by, you know, collective guilt, if you like. But there are other governments in Europe, for example, in Austria, you've just heard probably you'd be aware that there's a new legislation which restricts funding that Muslim communities can get. Some other countries, for example, Denmark, recently banned halal and kosher meals and so on. So in Europe, there's a varying degree to which the authorities will tolerate or, if you like, contribute to Islamophobia. But Islamophobia in Europe is real, and in the UK, for example, it is having real impact in people's lives, including some people who have lost their lives.
Yasmin, we just talked a moment ago about those very tragic shootings in Chapel Hill in North Carolina, in which 3 people lost their lives. Officials were very quick to point out in the immediate aftermath of those shootings that this was a criminal action. This was not a hate crime. Sure. Would it have been different if the shooter was Muslim and the 3 people were Christians?
I mean, that's the issue, right? That's the concern that the overwhelming Muslim American community had, that if this shooter, first of all, if the shooter was Muslim or had some sort of connections to, extremist groups that are tied to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, etc., this would immediately have been called, an act of terror. Right. So from the outset, the way it was framed in the media obviously would have been different. And also, I think the concern that a lot of Muslim Americans had was that, if it was reversed, would the government been quick to come out and say that, this was a hate crime? Why is it that there was the issue about the parking dispute? Why is it that the media suddenly took the narrative of the defendant's family as opposed to highlighting the narrative of the victims' families? So those were issues that was quite troubling for Muslim Americans.
Go ahead, Abdullah.
I was saying this is not a hypothetical question. There has been a number of cases in recent months where there was a crime, murder, in Oklahoma, in California, in other places, where the murderer was Muslim, and neither the media nor the law enforcement, they did not waste any time basically tying this into some sort of a global jihadi terror network, or immediately arriving into conclusions that this must be because of that person's religious belief or religious ideology or religious affiliation. I want to clarify, though, I think the sensationalist flavor and the fashion in overall media, they sort of distorted the law enforcement initial message. the local police officials, they were immediately quick to correct their mistake, saying this was initially considered as a crime triggered by a parking dispute, but the law enforcement, neither the state nor the federal agencies, are not dismissing any option, including the hate crime. They are turning every stone over, and they are not dismissing the potential hate crime. We will wait and see.
But I think the point being made is that whereas they say we're not dismissing any option, if it had been a Muslim shooter, there would only be one option, wouldn't there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is no doubt about that. And what hurts the Muslim community the most, this innate hypocrisy, the innate double standard that the Muslim community has been facing. We have been told long judicial linguistic jargon, like in order to be considered as hate crime, it has to go through so many different hoops. But when the murderer and the killer is a Muslim, why those technical details never apply, I have no idea.
Tala Ahmed, in Britain you have a significant Muslim population, many of whom were born in Britain, many of whom have acquired British citizenship. Are they treated as British by the government, or are they still treated as foreigners? Because we hear so many times that people who commit crimes, and they could be crimes of terrorism in Britain, will be repatriated to their home countries. Their home country is Britain.
Yeah, I think that's, if you observe the media and indeed the political narrative, I think the undertone is very clear that Muslims are somehow a foreign entity which is trying to find space within the UK, when that in fact is not the case. Only about 2 weeks ago, we at the Muslim Council of Britain produced a report on UK Muslim population based on census data collected by the government in 2011. And what it shows is that Muslim community is as diverse as the wider British society, if you like, and half of the Muslims were born in the UK. Despite all of that, every time we speak about, and you mentioned, for example, deprivation of citizenship and revocation of citizenship and so forth, we are spoken as if Muslims are the other, and yet we are not. And I think that is a major challenge for the policymakers in the UK and in Europe to recognize that Islam and Muslims are part and parcel of the European society as much as any other faith. But I just wanted to pick on the point around Chapel Hill shooting and also what happened in the UK. I think your previous contributor was absolutely right that one of the problems that we see is that whenever a crime affects Muslim community, that somehow is not covered and somehow it is pushed aside as an ordinary crime. And yet when the perpetrators are Muslims, they seem to suddenly get unprecedented level of publicity, even if it has nothing to do with their faith. And a classic example was there's an individual, a converted Muslim, who happened to kill a retired lady in a part of London. It has nothing to do with his faith, or it wasn't linked with, if you like, so-called jihadi terrorist kind of activities. And yet the initial temptation of the media was to run, they brought his identity as a converted Muslim who went into killing. So that's something that the media and the policymakers has to be more aware of and be particularly careful that we do not create unnecessary divide between Muslims and others. Muslims are part and parcel of the wider society, and they should be spoken about in those terms.
Another criticism we often...
And if I...
Yeah, go ahead, Abdullah.
If I may quickly, one of the most destructive consequences of Islamophobia, marginalizing and dehumanizing a collective religious minority, it sort of forces the wider community to have lowered their standards of idealism towards that community. It creates an exceptionalism in terms of inclusivity and acceptance. Regretfully, that's what we are seeing about Islam and Muslims. When Americans at large are being asked, do you believe in religious freedom? Do you think everybody should be practice their religion as they like? Do you think they should be free to establish their house of worship? Overwhelming majority, more than 90% of Americans says yes to that question. But when the same Americans are asked, do you feel comfortable having a mosque in your neighborhood? Would you feel comfortable having a Muslim neighbor in your area? Or when they specifically ask the same question about Islam as religion and Muslims as people, or Muslims, American Muslims as American citizens, that percentage goes in some states as low as 30%, 40%.
Okay, Yasmin, another criticism we often hear, and we see this on the media very often, is people on the media saying that Muslim leaders do not criticize acts of terrorism that are carried out in the name of Islam. Yet, And I read the media pretty extensively. I often see, especially in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo killings, that there were leaders in France, Muslim leaders in France, who immediately condemned those killings. I mean, are people just not listening, or they just don't want to listen?
I mean, that's a very good point. Anytime I hear that criticism, I kind of just chuckle, because that's flat out wrong. Whether it be, like you said, whether it was in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo attacks, or whether it's any time ISIS commits a heinous atrocity, I mean, you see Muslim organizations like coming out immediately condemning it. I think, but again, I think a part of it is the way these incidents are portrayed in the media. For example, I think your other commentators made it very clear that the media is very selective in what they try to portray. So they're going to obviously portray the most heinous crimes and terror attacks constantly just flooding the airways. But when they see actually Muslim organizations, Muslim leaders condemning these acts, they give them very little attention. So Americans don't see that. Americans don't see what Muslims are actually doing to counter this extremist, tendencies, whether it comes from their communities or elsewhere. I think a great example was, what we saw. I think there was over 1,000 Muslims that came in defense of the Jewish community, synagogue recently, and that was a great example, and that was portrayed very well in the media. And if we continue to at least portray a more balanced or a nuanced approach to this issue, and be more, I guess, like fair, and trying to portray the Muslim American community or Muslims in general in Europe and elsewhere in a more fair light, I think that we'll see Islamophobia trending down.
Okay, and that's where we are going to have to leave it. Thanks to all three of you for joining us. We are going to take a break. Coming up, we speak to a former Pakistani ambassador who spent much of his time in Europe talking with young Muslims and religious leaders. We will get his take on Islamophobia in the region. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.